The Lord be with you. I hope so. Now let me begin by apologizing for the title of this talk. I hope I have not offended anyone by calling it rampant heterosexualism. It was intended to be called rampant male heterosexualism. But somehow there was a bit of a gender realignment, and that was missed from the title. With that apart, I don't really want to talk much about male heterosexualism, except to say that in many of the salient and contentious issues of the day, it is often straight, self-opinionated and insecure but power-hungry men who have been the main problem. Oh, I see that was women who are clapping. When race relations were at a low point and people talked about the black problem, it was often actually a problem with white men, people who were in the Ku Klux Klan in America and people who followed Terre Blanche in South Africa. When inside the church and the government and economic institutions, those who were female began to demand equal treatment, it was referred to as the women's problem, but actually it was a problem for men who were fearing the loss of privilege. When people in the current debates talk about the problem with immigrants and blame them for running down the National Health Service and for there being a lack of jobs, it's very often men who have never met an immigrant or engaged with someone who's a Muslim who make these kind of accusations. And when we come to homosexuality, the main opponents have been men, often rampant male heterosexuals, who, among other things, associate male homosexuality with effeminate behaviour, and that reminds them of women whose liberation still causes discomfort. Last night, it just happened, I was talking to this woman. She was introduced to me as Sayyida, and she was clearly a Muslim. We had a very interesting conversation, and later I discovered that she was actually Baroness Vassi. That was not clear at the time, but when she said that when she was asked whether she had developed homophobia because of the Quran, in which there's not much said about it, she said, no, I developed homophobia because of men in the Tory party. On the day I began to write this talk, I heard news on the radio of how the Anglican Archbishop of Uganda stated that he would not share communion with those who supported an unbiblical view of marriage. Now, what exactly is an unbiblical or a biblical view of marriage? First, it could be polygamy, because very few of the Jewish patriarchs stuck to one wife. Abraham had 2 plus a concubine. His grandson Jacob had 2 plus 2 concubines. Samson had a wife, but she married his best man, so he ended up with a prostitute and a devious hairdresser in compensation. David, the forebear of Jesus, had many wives and lovers, more than he had fingers, and his son Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, in all of which cases women were no more than chattels. Is that a biblical view of marriage? Or does the Archbishop of Uganda favour the understanding of marriage espoused by St. Paul, who states that one reason for marriage is a lack of self-control, at least as regards the male partner? But Paul also spends more time and ink on what he regards as aberrant behaviour in women with respect to headgear, speaking the church, and gossip, than he does on peculiarly male traits. And in a revealing comment says that he wishes that others could be like himself, unmarried. Of course, what the Archbishop of Uganda was ostensibly criticising was same-sex marriage, which is certainly not mentioned in the Bible. But I have to say that as regards heterosexual marriage, the Bible is unlikely to be a book of helpful hints for fulfilling matrimony. So, as you will now be aware, I'm going to speak about homosexuality. And at the end of this talk, there's no questions, but if people want to question me either on my personal commitment to this issue or things I've said, then at 5 o'clock in the Northern Lights tent, which is way down the end of the shops, 5 o'clock in the Northern Lights tent, I'm open to question. I've probably at this festival spoken twice before on this issue and had no compulsion to return to it again, except for what I heard about Lizzie Love. Nick Burden is the rector of St James and Emmanuel Church in Disbury, south of Manchester. It's an evangelical Anglican parish with which I've had fond associations. Lizzie was an intelligent teenager in the congregation who occasionally babysat for the vicar and his wife. She'd had a history of mild depression, but nothing too concerning, and then one day in January of this year, she took her life. At the coroner's inquiry into her death, it was revealed that shortly before it happened, she had sent a text message to a friend which said, "I don't believe that God can love me the way I am." She knew herself to be lesbian, but also knew that the negativity which surrounded any talk of same-sex relationships within her wing of the church was such that she would be condemned. After her death, Nick felt that it was time that the congregation began to think about how it dealt with gay and lesbian people. At the mere mention of such a discussion, a number of members left. Now, is that an isolated incident? Well, I thought so until 2 months later, I was in a Baptist church where I met a man who, a number of years ago, had lost his son in the same way. He had taken his life because he was gay and he believed he was condemned by God and not wanted within the church. And then 2 weeks after that second encounter, I spoke to a friend of mine who said that for him, for 3 or 4 years, the thought of taking his life was in the horizon, because as he understood Scripture, as he understood the church, as he understood himself, he felt that he as a gay person was incompatible with someone who should be a disciple of Jesus. And then he discovered that there was a deliverance ministry. And he went from Scotland to Manchester in order to be delivered from this evil by someone who said he could change him and make him straight. Well, he didn't make him straight at all. In fact, the deliverance ministers tried to seduce him. And then my friends saw what a sham deliverance ministry and what a perverse activity it can be. So let me make some observations and then a personal comment. First of all, gay Christians are not exclusively from one wing of the church. I suppose I know as many people who are gay and who come from an evangelical background as I know people who are gay and come from a liberal background. And similarly, those who are condemnative of same-sex relationships do not belong to one sector of the church's theological spectrum. Secondly, many gay Christians, until recently, were frequently in heterosexual marriages for fear of being discovered. And also because the evangelical counsel given to gay men was, perhaps you will find an understanding woman. I don't know what that says much about women, never mind men. What was a woman in such a relationship to understand? That the man who at the altar vowed to love and cherish her would have to fake it when it came to sex. And when I was coming down the train yesterday, I thought, can I substantiate that? And within 2 minutes, I thought, yes, I know 10 men, some of them now dead, all of whom were ministers in my church, who, because of a fear of exposure, went into marital relations, which in most cases were unfulfilled, frustrating, and in some cases cruel. But they followed the evangelical advice. Perhaps you'll find an understanding woman. Some prominent Christians encouraged perverse surveillance activity. People like God's copper, James Anderton, the Chief Constable of Manchester, from 1976 to 1991. He was a devout Christian who encouraged young constables to go to places where gay men patronized, make themselves look seductive, and then arrest anyone who showed an interest. During this period, secular counsellors and psychiatrists alike protested in the light of detailed research that so-called deliverance ministries could not turn homosexuals into heterosexuals, but people of faith preferred to believe otherwise. Is it any wonder that given this attitudinal history, the churches have lost the respect and even the interest of young generations who have not just believed that it's okay to be gay, but who regard homophobia now as an offense. David Myers is the professor of psychology at Hope College in Michigan, Hope University in Michigan. He's a world-renowned scholar and a Calvinist Christian who changed his mind on this subject. And he made the following comments in a published article. From their analysis of the increasing number of religious knowns, people who don't associate themselves with one church or another, researchers Robert Putnam and David Campbell have discerned that intolerance of homosexuality is proving to be the single strongest factor in alienating today's youth and young adults from the church. Writer Amy Sullivan has observed that the church's anti-gay public image has been devastating for the image of Christianity. When the Barna Group polled Americans aged 16 to 29 on what words best describe Christianity, the top response was anti-homosexual. In more derisive words, this is how some academics explain young Americans' declining religiosity. The ascendancy of the extreme fundamentalists and their grip on the GOP, the Republican Party, has meant that the ugliest, meanest, most anti-science, most intolerant side of Christianity, anti-abortion, homophobic, racist, sexually repressed, and woman-hating, and hating anyone different from them, that has become the public face of Christianity. In states where they have enacted their hard-right agenda, the polls show a huge backlash from millennials and young people who are much more tolerant of gays, other races, and much more pro-science and feminist in orientation. These young people have not switched to more liberal Christian denominations, they've left religion altogether. When one reflects on the way in which the debates of homosexuality have been reported in recent years, there has been a reprehensible lack of attention to how lay people, including young people, are affected. It seems as if the dominant rhetoric has been about whether priests and pastors can or cannot be gay, can or cannot bless a civil partnership, or perform same-sex marriage. The crucial issue is not about what's appropriate for gay Christian clergy. The crucial issue is about how God's gay laity are treated. And having said this, I want to pay tribute to courageous people in my own nation, people like Kelvin Holdsworth, who's spoken here, and Scott Rennie, who have spoken within the church, particularly for the rights of gay clergy. I'm not dismissing that concern. But when people offered themselves for ordination, they knew the church's stance, and they had to some extent to take the consequences or fight against it. But most lay people know what the church's stance on what the clergy cannot or cannot do is. But they don't know about what they can do, about what's approved or disapproved. Congregations don't know how to include or exclude, support or patronize, treat as normal or as intrinsically disordered those gay, lesbian, bisexual, and other people who are still brave enough to stay in the church. I'm not here to advocate a plan of action, 10 things you can do to make gays welcome. I raise this issue because I do not want the importance of the gospel eclipsed by the continuing prevalence of any anti-gay narrative in the profile of the church. But there's also a personal reason. I have a vested interest in this subject because I'm gay. This is not a confession, it's an admission. You can confess a sin, but you admit to the truth. And this information may be new to you, but it's not new to me. I've known this as my identity from before I could read, and I wouldn't change it because I believe that God has made me the way I am. I don't have a partner. I don't have a partner, nor have I ever had one for over 30 years, since my denomination made it quite clear to me that I had to choose between my vocation or a relationship. And just in case anyone's wondering, I am not seriously seeking someone. This is a seminar, not a dating site. I've never intentionally said this in public before for a number of reasons. One is that my denomination gave me important work to do, to chair its liturgy committee and to be in charge of a new hymnal which the church was producing. And I did not want these things to be jeopardized because of an unhealthy interest in my sexuality. And secondly, I work as a team with 3 other people. We share a common salary pool. We have to make our own money, and I did not want our work to be compromised because someone might make a decision whether to invite us to work with them or not, dependent on my sexuality. But thirdly, I've always believed that if the truth is true, it should not be dependent on someone with a vested interest declaring it. Aware that I have a minor public profile, I did not want people to be more compassionate towards gay people because I was one. And so I encouraged rampant male heterosexuals to take a positive stand on gay people. And thank God many have done that, and some of them to their own cost. But these alone would not have brought me to self-disclosure. It was the suicide of Lizzie Lowe which convinced me that when there are still young people who doubt God loves them on account of their sexuality, those of us who are not compromised by our work, who are gay and who know the love of God, should not keep silent.